The Black Dog's Curse. The road to Ravenshade was long and winding, flanked by towering, gnarled trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. Thick fog clung to the ground like a ghostly veil, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Ethan Calloway, a journalist with a reputation for debunking urban legends, gripped the steering wheel as he navigated the desolate path. Beside him, Claire Dawson, his closest friend and photographer, was adjusting her camera settings. She glanced at the GPS, frowning. There's barely any signal out here. Are we sure this place even exists? In the back seat, Lucas Meyer, a paranormal investigator, chuckled. That's what makes it interesting. Places like this always have the best ghost stories. Sitting next to Lucas was Sophie Hart, an audio technician who specialized in analyzing strange sounds. She was reviewing recordings from their last case. I don't know, guys. I've read about Ravenshade. It's not just a ghost story. People go missing here. A whole family vanished last year. Ethan smirked, keeping his eyes on the road. Which is exactly why we're here. We find the truth, expose the myths, and move on. Behind them, Dr. William Grayson, a historian specializing in folklore, sighed. He was the oldest in the group, with graying hair and tired eyes. Ethan, you assume every legend has a logical explanation, but some stories are older than reason itself. Ethan shrugged. And yet we're still here, alive and well. As if in response, the car's headlights flickered for a moment. A chill ran through the group, but no one spoke. The Hollow Inn. The village appeared suddenly, hidden behind the thick forest. Ravenshade was small, with stone cottages and cobblestone streets that looked like they belonged to another era. The place seemed frozen in time, untouched by modern life. Ethan pulled the car up to the Hollow Inn, the only lodging available. The building was old, its wooden sign swaying in the cold breeze. Inside, the air smelled of aged wood and something else, something damp and musty like earth after heavy rain. A fireplace crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows along the walls. An old woman stood behind the reception desk. Her skin was weathered, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun. Her piercing blue eyes scanned the group carefully before she spoke. You should leave before nightfall. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. Ethan exchanged a glance with Claire before stepping forward. We're just here for a few nights. We're investigating the Black Dog legend. The woman's expression hardened. That is not a story. It is a curse. Lucas smirked. So you've seen it? She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out a ledger and tapped a bony finger on it. Sign in if you wish. But mark my words, the Black Dog does not forgive. Silence hung in the air as they scribbled their names. The moment Ethan put the pen down, the fireplace flickered violently, casting shadows that almost seemed to move on their own. Martha leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. It has already marked you. A cold gust of wind rattled the windows, and outside, somewhere in the darkness, a low growl echoed through the night. The night was colder than expected. A thick fog had settled over Ravenshade, muffling all sound and making the village feel even more isolated. The group had set up their equipment near the edge of the forest, Black Hollow Woods, the place where most of the sightings of the Black Dog had been reported. Sophie adjusted her audio recorder, scanning the sound waves on her laptop. It's too quiet, she murmured. Even in a place like this, we should be hearing something. Crickets, owls, the wind. But it's just nothing. Ethan glanced at her screen. She was right. There were no natural sounds. Just an eerie, unnatural silence. Lucas turned on the infrared camera, panning it slowly through the trees. If there's something here, this will pick it up. Claire took a few test shots with her camera, capturing the twisted trees and dense fog. She lowered it, sighing. Maybe the dog only appears when someone is alone. The stories say it targets individuals, not groups. Ethan smirked. Nice try. You're not going off on your own. She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Then Sophie's microphone crackled. A deep guttural growl came through the speakers. It was faint at first, then grew louder, more distinct, a sound too large to belong to any normal dog. Everyone froze. Lucas swung the infrared camera towards the trees. Something's there, he whispered. They turned and saw it. A massive black dog stood at the tree line, partially obscured by the mist. Its form was unnaturally large, its fur darker than the shadows around it. Its eyes glowed an eerie red, like embers in a dying fire. But the worst part? It wasn't moving. It just watched, Lucas whispered. Holy! Claire raised her camera and clicked the shutter. The moment the flash went off, the black dog vanished. Not into the forest, not behind a tree. It simply disappeared. A chilling gust of wind swept through the clearing, sending leaves swirling around their feet. And then they heard it, a whisper. Not from one direction, but from everywhere at once. A voice so low and distant it felt like it came from the depths of the earth itself. Leave. The word echoed through the night, carried by the wind. For the first time, Ethan felt something he had never felt before on an investigation. Fear. The wind howled through the trees as the group stood frozen in place. The last echoes of the whispered warning still lingering in the air. The black dog had vanished, but the unease it left behind was suffocating. Claire lowered her camera, her hands trembling. Tell me someone else saw that, she whispered. I saw it, Lucas muttered, his face pale. And I got it on the infrared camera. Sophie glanced at her laptop screen, her breath catching. The audio... There's something else. She pressed play. The growl they had heard earlier replayed. But now there was something more, a second sound layered beneath it. A deep, rasping breath. Like something massive was standing right behind them. Ethan's mind raced. This wasn't like any other investigation. Legends were just stories, until now. Then a realization hit him. Where's Claire? The group turned. She was gone. Her camera lay on the ground, its lens shattered. The fog had thickened, swallowing the path she had stood on just moments ago. Lucas cursed. She was right here. Sophie grabbed Ethan's arm. We have to find her, now. Ethan picked up Claire's camera, his heart hammering. She can't have gone far. Spread out, but don't lose sight of each other. The search. They ventured into the forest, calling Claire's name. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became. The trees seemed closer together, the shadows darker. Then Lucas stopped. Guys, his voice was barely above a whisper. They followed his gaze. Hanging from a low tree branch was Claire's jacket. It was soaked in something dark. Blood. Sophie covered her mouth to stop a scream. No, 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 no! Dr. Grayson stepped forward, his face grim. He touched the fabric and shook his head. It's still warm. Ethan swallowed hard. She's still alive. Lucas turned slowly, scanning the forest. Or something took her. A low growl rumbled through the trees, impossibly deep and close. Then footsteps, heavy, deliberate. Ethan held up his flashlight, his pulse hammering. Who's there? Silence. Then a voice. You shouldn't have come. It was Claire's voice, but it was wrong. The sound was hollow, empty, like something was speaking through her, not with her. And then, from the darkness, she stepped forward, or at least something that looked like Claire. Her skin was paler, her eyes hollow and dark. A twisted smile stretched across her face. You shouldn't have come, she whispered again, tilting her head unnaturally. Then she lunged. The nightmare begins. The group scattered, adrenaline taking over. Ethan grabbed Sophie's arm, pulling her away as Lucas and Dr. Grayson ran in opposite directions. Claire, or whatever she had become, moved too fast, unnaturally fast. She grabbed Lucas by the collar, dragging him backward. He screamed, thrashing, but her grip was inhumanly strong. Ethan turned, ready to help, but then he saw it, the black dog standing behind her. Its red eyes locked onto him, and for the first time in his life, Ethan felt true terror. Then the beast let out a sound, a low, deep growl that shook the earth itself. And just like that, the forest swallowed them whole. Ethan and Sophie ran. The forest was a maze of twisted branches and fog, the ground uneven beneath their feet. Lucas's screams had already faded into the distance, replaced by an unnatural silence. Ethan gasped for breath, his mind racing. What had happened to Claire? Was she possessed? Or had she become something else entirely? Beside him, Sophie was barely keeping up. We have to get to the village, she panted. We need help. A snapping branch made them stop in their tracks. The black dog was there, not running, not chasing, just watching. Its eyes burned red, unblinking, fixed on Ethan. The shadows around it twisted unnaturally, making it look larger than before. Sophie took a step back. The dog didn't move, but the ground beneath her shifted, like something alive was crawling beneath the dirt. Then came a whisper. "You are marked." The whisper was inside their heads, not in the air. Sophie grabbed Ethan's arm. "Run! The village won't save you." They burst out of the forest, sprinting through the empty streets of Ravenshade. The houses were dark, the windows like black pits. They reached the hollow inn, banging on the door. "Martha, open up!" The door swung open just before they could knock again. The old woman stood there, her face unreadable. "You saw it," she said grimly. "Lucas, Claire, they're gone!" Sophie cried. Martha shook her head. "They are not gone. They are claimed." Ethan grabbed her arm. "How do we stop it?" "You don't," Martha whispered. "The moment you saw it, the curse was sealed." Ethan shook his head. "No, there has to be a way." Martha hesitated. Then, for the first time, her cold expression wavered. "There is one way, but it requires a sacrifice." Sophie paled. "Whose sacrifice?" Martha's eyes flickered toward Ethan. Before she could answer, a low growl rumbled from inside the inn. They turned. Dr. Grayson stood in the hallway, his body rigid, his eyes completely black. "The dog has already chosen," he whispered. Then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the inn. The fire in the hearth guttered out as if something had stolen the very air from the room. The only sound was a low growl echoing from the shadows. Ethan's heart pounded. "Stay close," he whispered to Sophie. Dr. Grayson stood in the hallway, his body rigid, his eyes completely black. The voice that came from him wasn't his own. It was deeper, layered with something ancient and inhuman. "The dog has already chosen." Then, without warning, he lunged. Ethan barely dodged as Grayson slammed into the wall, his strength unnatural. He turned his head slowly, his mouth stretching into a too-wide grin. Sophie screamed, "He's not human anymore!" Martha grabbed Sophie's wrist, pulling her toward the back door. "Run!" Ethan hesitated, torn between fighting and fleeing. Grayson stepped forward, his movements jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. And then behind him, something else moved. Claire, or what was left of her. Her body was twisted, her limbs too long, her eyes black pits. Her lips curled into an unnatural smile, and when she spoke, it was a whisper inside their heads. "You should have left." Then she charged. The escape? Ethan turned and ran. Martha led them through the back door, into the cold night. The fog had thickened, swirling unnaturally. The village was silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "We have to leave," Sophie gasped, gripping Ethan's arm. "You can't run," Martha said. "Not from it." Ethan grabbed her by the shoulders. "Then tell me how to stop it." Martha looked at him with pity. "The black dog does not hunt for sport. It hunts for a purpose. It is bound to a debt. A life must be given for a life to be spared." Sophie's breath hitched. "A sacrifice." Ethan clenched his fists. "And if we don't? Then it will take you all." The growl returned, deep and bone-shaking, coming from everywhere at once. Then footsteps, heavy, slow. The black dog emerged from the fog, its form even larger than before. The shadows around it twisted, shifting unnaturally. It stopped a few feet away, staring at Ethan. Waiting. Martha's voice was barely a whisper. "It wants you." Ethan felt the truth settle in his bones. It had chosen him. Sophie's grip on his arm tightened. "No," she whispered. "There has to be another way." The ground trembled. The air grew thick and heavy. The dog's eyes burned brighter. Ethan looked at Sophie, then at Martha. Then he stepped forward. Sophie tried to grab him, but Martha held her back. It must be done. The dog did not move, its red eyes locked onto Ethan's. And then it lunged. "The end or not?" Sophie screamed. The shadows exploded outward, swallowing everything in darkness. The last thing she saw was Ethan's face twisted in pain, the black dog's massive form looming over him. Then, silence. When Sophie opened her eyes, it was dawn. The fog was gone. The village was empty. And Ethan was nowhere to be found. Martha stood beside her, her face unreadable. "It is done," she said simply. Sophie's hands trembled. "Where is he?" Martha looked at the forest, her expression distant. "Gone." The wind whispered through the trees. A single deep growl echoed from the distance. And Sophie knew Ethan was not dead. He had become part of the curse. And one day, the black dog would return. The Black Dog's Curse, the final chapter. The road to Ravenshade stretched endlessly before them, winding through twisted, gnarled trees that clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with an unnatural silence. No birds, no wind, not even the distant rustling of leaves. Only the dull hum of the car's engine broke the suffocating stillness. Sophie's fingers clenched around the steering wheel, her knuckles pale. The closer they got, the heavier the air became, pressing down on her chest like unseen hands. Beside her, Lucas sat rigid, his face tense, eyes flicking toward the darkness beyond the windshield. "You don't have to come," Sophie murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas let out a humorless laugh. "Like hell I'd let you go alone." They both knew the truth. This was suicide. Ravenshade wasn't just a place anymore, it was a trap. A graveyard, a cursed land where time twisted and death wasn't always permanent. And somewhere in that accursed village, Ethan was still waiting, or at least whatever was left of him. The first warning, Sophie tightened her grip on the wheel as the fog thickened, slithering across the cracked asphalt like ghostly fingers reaching for the tires. The temperature inside the car plummeted. Lucas exhaled sharply, rubbing his arms. "What the hell?" Before Sophie could respond, the radio flickered to life. At first, only static, a faint, distorted hum beneath the noise. Then, a voice. Low, hollow. "Turn back." Sophie's breath hitched. Lucas's hand shot toward the dial, but the moment his fingers touched it, the static turned into a blood-curdling scream. The sound ripped through the car, high-pitched and inhuman, a shriek of pure agony and rage. Sophie slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched as the car skidded to a halt, barely missing something standing in the middle of the road. A figure, tall, thin, motionless. Lucas gasped. "No, no, no, no!" Sophie's blood turned to ice. It was Ethan, or at least it looked like him, the thing in the road. Sophie's pulse pounded in her ears. Her headlights illuminated him, casting his long, still shadow across the cracked pavement. He wasn't moving, wasn't blinking. His skin looked wrong, pale, almost gray, stretched too tightly over his bones. And his eyes, black, completely black. A void, a hole where something else peered through. Sophie's voice trembled. "Ethan?" No response, not even a flicker of recognition. Lucas grabbed her wrist. "Sophie, don't—" But she was already pushing the car door open. The moment her feet touched the ground, the fog thickened. The temperature dropped even further, her breath turning into icy mist. Ethan's head tilted slightly. His body twitched just a little, like a puppet on tangled strings. And then, in a voice that wasn't entirely his, he spoke. "It knows you're here." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "What? What does?" Ethan's lips parted as if struggling to answer. But before he could, the growl came. At first it was a deep, low vibration, more felt than heard. Then it grew, louder, closer, a sound that made the air tremble, that sent a primal terror ripping through Sophie's veins. Lucas spun toward the darkness beyond the car. "Oh, my God!" Sophie turned slowly. From the swirling fog, two burning red eyes emerged. The black dog stepped out of the mist. It was even larger than before. Its body was made of shadows, its fur shifting and twisting unnaturally, like smoke trying to hold form. Its mouth hung open, rows of jagged, uneven teeth glistening in the dim light. Black saliva dripping onto the ground and sizzling where it touched. It wasn't just a dog. It was something else. Something ancient, something hungry. It wasn't just hunting them. It was claiming them. Then, it lunged. Sophie's heart pounded against her ribs as she dove back into the car, slamming the door shut just as the black dog's massive form collided with the metal. The impact was so violent the entire car shook, the windows rattling from the sheer force. Lucas screamed, "Go! Drive!" Sophie didn't need to be told twice. She yanked the gear shift, slamming her foot on the accelerator. The tires screeched as the car lurched forward, barely dodging the beast's second attack. Through the rearview mirror, she saw it. The black dog was already chasing them. Its body moved like liquid shadow, its form stretching and distorting, covering unnatural distances with each bound. Its red eyes burned through the fog, locked onto her. And then Ethan was suddenly in front of the car. Sophie's foot slammed on the brakes. The car screeched, skidding to a halt inches from his unmoving body. For a moment, the world stood still. The black dog stopped as well. And Sophie realized it wasn't attacking Ethan, it was waiting. Lucas gripped Sophie's arm, his voice low. That's not him, Sophie. Sophie couldn't breathe. Ethan was standing in the road, facing them, completely still. His face was pale, almost corpse-like, his lips slightly parted as if about to speak. But his eyes, those empty pitch-black voids, they weren't human. Something else was inside him. Lucas's voice was a whisper. We need to go. Sophie barely heard him. She slowly pushed the door open, stepping onto the cold, wet asphalt. Ethan, she whispered. No response. She took a step forward. Ethan, it's me, Sophie. You're okay now. Ethan's body twitched violently. Then, his head jerked up too fast, too unnatural. His mouth opened wider, too wide. And he whispered, It knows you're here. Sophie's stomach dropped. Lucas stepped out of the car, pulling her back. Sophie, please. Ethan twitched again. His entire body jerked as if something inside him was trying to move the limbs for the first time. Then, in a horrifyingly broken voice, he laughed. It wasn't Ethan's laugh. It was distorted, like 100 voices layered on top of each other, a deep, echoing sound that didn't belong to this world. Sophie stumbled backward. Ethan, what happened to you? Ethan's black eyes locked onto hers. Then finally he spoke. It has me. It will have you too. Sophie's hands shook. Ethan, please! But then, the black dog moved. The growl shook the air, deep and rumbling like a storm beneath the earth. The black dog stepped forward, its eyes never leaving Sophie. It wasn't chasing her anymore. It was stalking, playing. It already knew how this would end. Lucas grabbed Sophie's wrist, yanking her toward the car. Run! But before they could, Ethan moved. One moment he was standing still. The next he was right in front of Sophie. His hand shot out, fingers digging into her arm with unnatural strength. His lips curled into a horrifying grin. You shouldn't have come back, Sophie screamed. Lucas punched Ethan, but it was like hitting a stone wall. The force barely made him flinch. Ethan's grip tightened, pulling Sophie closer. His skin was ice cold. And his breath, it wasn't human. It smelled like rot, like old blood, like something that had been dead for far too long. Then in a whisper that slithered into her bones, he spoke. It's inside me, Sophie, and now it's inside you too. Sophie's vision swam. Something cold seeped into her arm where Ethan touched her. A darkness crawling under her skin, spreading through her veins. She could feel it. Whispers, pressing against the edges of her mind. Something trying to get in. Lucas didn't hesitate. He grabbed a rusty crowbar from the car, swinging it with every ounce of strength he had. Crack! Ethan's head jerked sideways with the impact, releasing Sophie. She fell backward, gasping. Lucas grabbed her, pulling her toward the car. We have to go! Sophie stumbled into the driver's seat, hands shaking as she fumbled with the ignition. Behind them, Ethan twitched again. Then he started laughing, that same broken, nightmarish sound. And the black dog, it was still watching, waiting. Sophie slammed her foot on the gas. The tires screeched, the car lurching forward as they sped down the dark road. Lucas turned in his seat, breath ragged. Ethan's gone, he whispered. He's not coming back. But Sophie, she wasn't so sure, because in the rearview mirror she saw him, standing perfectly still, smiling. And then, before the fog swallowed him whole, he lifted one hand and waved. The road twisted and turned, disappearing into the thick, suffocating fog. The car sped forward, its tires barely gripping the wet pavement as Sophie clenched the wheels so tight her knuckles turned white. Beside her, Lucas sat in rigid silence, his face pale and drawn, his breathing uneven. The weight of what they had just witnessed sat heavy between them. Ethan was gone. At least the Ethan they had known. But he had looked right at them. And he had smiled. Sophie's arm ached, a dull, deep pain radiating from the spot where Ethan had grabbed her. She shifted her grip on the wheel, stealing a quick glance. Her skin was changing. A faint black vein-like pattern had begun to spread up her arm, like cracks forming in shattered glass. The darkness pulsed, writhing just beneath her skin, as if alive. Her stomach twisted. Lucas, my arm! Lucas turned, and the moment he saw it, his face drained of all color. Sophie, he whispered, his voice barely audible. That's the same mark Ethan had. Her breath hitched. The mark was spreading, faster than before. Her veins darkened, creeping further toward her shoulder, tendrils of inky blackness slithering under her skin. Lucas swallowed hard. It's inside you. Sophie's hands shook on the wheel. The whispers returned. A low, distant murmur at first, like a voice calling from the depths of an abyss. Then they grew louder, pressing against her mind. "Let it in," Sophie gasped, squeezing her eyes shut. "No, no, no, no." The car jerked violently as she momentarily lost control. Lucas grabbed the wheel. "Sophie, focus! You can fight this!" But the whispers wouldn't stop. It's already too late. A sharp pain lanced through Sophie's chest. For a brief moment, she wasn't in the car anymore. She was somewhere else, a place drenched in shadow, where the ground felt like it was alive beneath her feet. A dark figure loomed before her. Red eyes, jagged teeth, the black dog. It spoke in a voice that rattled her very soul. "You are mine now," Sophie screamed. Lucas shook her hard. "Sophie, wake up!" Her eyes flew open. She was still in the car. The fog had thickened, swirling around them like smoke from a dying fire. Something was wrong. The road, it was different. Lucas's voice wavered. "Sophie, where the hell are we?" The signs were missing. The trees weren't the same. Even the sky seemed darker, as if the night itself had deepened. A cold chill ran down Sophie's spine. This isn't the road back. Lucas checked the GPS. His hands shook. The screen flickered, and then it glitched out completely. No roads, no signal. Nothing. Just a single word appeared on the screen. "Turn back." Sophie's stomach twisted. "Lucas, we're still in Ravenshade." Lucas's breath came out in short, panicked bursts. "That's impossible. We've been driving for over an hour." Sophie tried to swallow her fear. No, time doesn't work right here. She gripped the wheel. She wouldn't let this place take them. She pressed her foot hard on the accelerator. They had to get out. Now, watch her in the fog. The car raced forward, cutting through the endless fog. But then, something moved ahead of them. A tall, shadowy figure, standing perfectly still in the middle of the road. Sophie slammed the brakes. The car screeched to a halt just inches away. Lucas's voice was a whisper. "Is it Ethan?" Sophie's chest tightened. It wasn't. The figure was too tall, too thin. Its arms hung unnaturally low, its fingers long and jagged like broken bones. And then it tilted its head, slowly. A deep, chilling growl rumbled through the air. Then it moved, faster than anything human. Straight toward them, Sophie screamed. Lucas reached for the glove compartment, grabbing the rusty crowbar from earlier. But before he could react, the figure hit the car. The impact shook the vehicle violently, metal groaning under the force. A long, clawed hand slammed against Sophie's window. A face pressed against the glass. Not human, not even close. It was grinning, with rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. Lucas raised the crowbar. "Sophie, drive!" Sophie didn't hesitate. She slammed her foot on the gas. The car jerked forward, throwing the creature backward. For a moment, she thought they had escaped. But then, a loud, ear-splitting howl shook the air, and in the rearview mirror, Sophie saw it. The black dog. Running straight for them. The hunt had truly begun. The car raced through the endless fog, tires screeching as Sophie gripped the wheel with trembling hands. The road stretched longer than it should have, twisting like a maze designed to trap them. Lucas clutched the rusty crowbar in his lap, his breath sharp and uneven. He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, watching as the black dog ran behind them, faster, closer. Its massive, shadowy body blurred at the edges, warping and shifting, like it wasn't fully part of this world, and its eyes, burning red, focused on Sophie. She could hear its deep, guttural growl vibrating through the air, seeping into her bones. "It's inside me." Ethan's words echoed in her mind. The mark on her arm pulsed, the black veins stretching further, creeping up toward her shoulder. She could feel something cold slithering under her skin, twisting, spreading. The whispers in her head were louder now. "Let it in." "Stop fighting. You belong here." Her vision blurred for a second, the road ahead flickering. And suddenly she wasn't in the car anymore, the place that should not exist. Sophie stood in a place drenched in darkness. The air was thick and wet, heavy with the scent of decay. Around her, massive black trees loomed, their twisted branches reaching out like clawed fingers. And ahead, A massive iron gate, rusted and ancient, stood half open. Beyond it there was a house. Or at least what used to be a house. The structure was rotting, its walls cracked, its windows nothing but hollow black voids. But the worst part? The black dog was waiting at the entrance. Sophie's heart pounded. The beast didn't attack. It just watched. And then a voice slithered through the air. "You're almost home." Sophie's body jerked violently. And just like that, she was back in the car. Lucas was shaking her. "Sophie! Sophie!" Her hands had gone limp on the wheel. The car had begun to drift. Straight toward the edge of the road. A sharp cliff. A dead end. Sophie gasped, snapping back to reality. She yanked the wheel hard, skidding the car to a sharp stop, inches from the drop. For a moment, everything was silent. Only the sound of their ragged breathing filled the air. Then Lucas turned, his voice low, shaking. "Sophie, we're trapped." Town that wasn't there. Sophie gritted her teeth, trying to push back the cold sickness spreading through her body. "We can't stay here," she said. Lucas nodded, gripping the crowbar tighter. "Then we run." They pushed the car doors open, stepping onto the damp, uneven road. The fog curled around them, thick as smoke, moving like something alive. Then, a street lamp flickered in the distance. Sophie's pulse spiked. There hadn't been any lights before. Lucas followed her gaze. Where the hell? More lights blinked on, one by one, stretching out into the fog. A row of them, leading to something. A town. Small, old, frozen in time. The buildings were weathered, abandoned, the windows dark. The streets were empty. But there was something off. The houses were too perfect. The town felt like a memory, a place that had once existed but no longer did. Lucas swallowed. "I don't like this." Sophie's breath hitched. "I think we're supposed to go there." Lucas shook his head. "Sophie, no. That's exactly what it wants." But before she could answer, something moved in the fog, a shadowy figure, standing just a few feet ahead. Not the black dog. Something else. And then it spoke. "Sophie, I've been waiting for you." Her blood ran cold. It was Ethan. Choice that cannot be undone. Ethan stepped forward, his movements unnatural, twitching. His skin was paler than before, almost gray, his blackened veins creeping up his neck. But his eyes, they were still pitch black. Still empty. Sophie took a step back. "You're not real." Ethan smiled. "Neither are you, not anymore." Sophie felt it then. The whispers in her mind. The ache in her arm. The sickness. The coldness spreading inside her. She was changing. Lucas grabbed her hand, pulling her backward. "Sophie, don't listen to him." But Ethan didn't move. He just tilted his head, smiling wider. And then he raised his hand, revealing something in his palm, a small rusty key. Sophie's stomach twisted. "What is that?" she whispered. Ethan's grin widened. "The key to the house." Sophie stiffened. She knew which house. The one from her vision. The rotting house beyond the gate. The place where it all started. Ethan took a slow step forward. "The only way to end this," he whispered, "is to go inside." Lucas tightened his grip on Sophie's wrist. "No," he hissed. "We're not playing this game. We're getting out." Ethan smiled. "You already know, Sophie," he whispered. "The black dog won't let you leave. Not until it gets what it wants." Sophie's chest tightened. She looked down at her arm. The black veins had nearly reached her shoulder. Her body felt heavier, colder. The whispers grew louder. Lucas pulled her closer. "Sophie, listen to me. We find another way." But Ethan simply held out the key. "You're running out of time," he said softly. "You can either fight the curse or finish what we started." The wind howled around them. The fog thickened, and in the distance, a deep guttural growl rumbled through the town. The black dog was coming. Sophie looked at the key, at the road ahead, at the shadow of the rotting house in her mind, and she realized there was only one way this could end. She reached out and took the key. Sophie gripped the rusty key tightly in her trembling hand. It felt unnaturally cold, like holding a piece of frozen metal, despite the damp warmth in the air. Lucas's voice was low, urgent. "Sophie, don't do this." She turned to him, her breath uneven. "We don't have a choice." Lucas's jaw clenched. There's always a choice. But he was wrong. The black dog was coming. Its low, guttural growl rumbled through the empty streets of the ghost town, shaking the ground beneath them. The fog twisted unnaturally, pulling back like an unseen force was parting it, revealing the beast. It stood at the end of the road, massive, shifting. Its fur was black as the void, its eyes a glowing crimson hell. Sophie's veins burned. The mark had spread to her collarbone now, creeping toward her heart. And the whispers. "Come home! Come home! Come home!" The house appeared in the distance, exactly as she had seen it in her vision, rotting, ancient, waiting. Ethan stood beside her, his lips curling into a crooked smile. "You're already part of this, Sophie. You just need to open the door." Sophie turned toward Lucas. "I have to do this," she whispered.
And then...
She ran. Lucas cursed, sprinting after her. The black dog howled. The moment Sophie reached the rusted iron gate, the air thickened. Her breath turned to mist, her skin prickled with unseen hands pulling at her. The house loomed over her. Closer, closer. Lucas grabbed her arm just as she reached the door. "Sophie, stop!" But the key was already in the lock, and the door creaked open. The moment it did, the ground trembled. The black dog let out a monstrous snarl, and Sophie stepped inside. Darkness swallowed her whole. For a moment there was nothing. Then, the air shifted, and she was no longer inside an abandoned house. She was somewhere else. The house was alive. The walls breathed, pulsed, their wooden panels twisting like flesh. The scent of rotting earth and something old, something ancient filled her lungs. And in the center of the room, a figure sat in a chair. Ethan, but not the Ethan she knew. This Ethan was older, hollowed out. His skin was gray, stretched over sharp bones. His lips were dry and cracked. His eyes were pitch black. And he was waiting. "You finally came back." Sophie took a shaky step forward. "What is this place?" Ethan smiled. "This is where it all began."
And then...
The walls split open, and she saw them. Dozens, hundreds of people, trapped in the walls. Their faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes were hollow. Sophie stumbled back, her pulse hammering. "What the hell?" Ethan tilted his head. "They were like you once. Chosen." The house groaned, the walls shifting, changing. She could hear them whispering, "Join us. Join us." Sophie's veins burned. She clutched her chest. The mark was complete. She had become part of the curse. Lucas's voice rang from the doorway. "Sophie!" She turned. But the door was gone. Only darkness remained. Ethan stood, stepping closer. "You can't leave, Sophie." "You never could."
And then...
The black dog stepped into the room. It towered over them, its eyes burning red, its teeth gleaming in the dark. It wasn't hunting anymore. It had won. Lucas banged against the vanished door. "Sophie, fight it!" But Sophie knew. There was no way out, unless... Her hand brushed against the crowbar in her pocket. She looked at Ethan, then at the walls of trapped souls, and finally at the black dog. A thought formed, a terrible, horrifying thought. She stepped closer to Ethan. Her voice was calm, cold. "I won't be like you." Before he could react, she drove the crowbar straight into his chest. Ethan screamed. The walls shook violently, the voices crying out in agony. The black dog let out a monstrous roar, rearing back. The house began to collapse. Lucas's hand found hers. "Run!" They sprinted toward the darkness. And suddenly, the door was there. The house howled in fury, its walls melting into the void. Sophie threw herself through the door, and everything turned white. Epilogue. Sophie woke to the sound of birds. She gasped, sitting up, her body aching. She was in the car. Lucas was beside her, blinking in shock. The fog was gone. The town was gone. The house was gone. Only an empty, cracked road stretched ahead of them. Lucas turned to her, his voice shaking. "Sophie, did we make it?" Sophie swallowed. Then slowly she looked down at her arm. The black veins were gone, but something new was there. A scar, in the shape of a dog's paw. She exhaled. "We got away." But deep inside she knew. They hadn't escaped. They had been allowed to leave. And one day, the black dog would come calling again. The end.